Welcome, Jet fans. It is draft day. It is officially the day where the Jets take the opportunity to really bolster this roster one last time before we really start hitting the summer months, and there'll be small little upgrades here and there. But this is the last true chance the Jets have to really upgrade this roster in a meaningful way, and they're doing so with a top 10 pick. They also have a pick on day two in the third round, and then have a few picks on day three. So again, we're focusing on day one here. I'm going to do a little bit of a quick mock draft. Really just kind of looking through this order one more time. I think we all have an idea of how this is going to go. Most likely in the top of the draft, dominantly offense. Right now, I think we're slated to have like one, maybe two defensive players go in the top 10, but there's always a shock in the top of the draft. There's always something that we never expect to happen that all of a sudden happens. I go back to the Jets draft with Sauce Gardner. Not many people had Devin Stingley going ahead of Sauce Gardner. It happened. Sauce was able to fall number four. In the same draft, Drake London. Not many people had him ahead of Garrett Wilson. I know it was a little split. There was many receivers that people liked, but I think it was a pretty close conclusion that Garrett Wilson should have been the top receiver in that draft, and rightfully so. First couple years of his career have been outstanding, um, considering the quarterback play. And then last year, I think a lot of us pegged Darnell Wright as maybe the third or fourth best offensive tackle. Well, he ended up being the second guy picked because he was so dominant at right tackle. So there's always a little shocker, always something that happens that no one really expects. And I'll go through some of those scenarios that possibly could be beneficial to the Jets. But I'm going to go through this mock draft and really just go through it, how I really think this will go if all goes according to plan. So obviously, we all know the top three. Um, it's going to be quarterback, quarterback, quarterback. We all know Caleb Williams number one, a mixture of Daniels and Drake May number two and three. I think it's Daniels two, May number three. Then we get to a little bit of the interesting part of the draft, moving forward into the Chargers pick, or I'm sorry, Arizona's pick first, the fourth pick. And here's how I think these two picks are going to go. One way or another, I think McCarthy does go in one of these slots, whether or not Arizona decides to trade back or the Chargers decide to trade back. It could be an interesting scenario here where Arizona trades back for someone who wants McCarthy, and then someone else trades up into the Chargers pick to get Marvin Harrison Jr. So it really just depends on how this all shapes out. But regardless, I do think it's going to be McCarthy here, Marvin Harrison Jr. going in some order. If it's four going Marvin Harrison Jr., that means likely the Cardinals picked him. There was no trade out. And then I think at five, there would be a potential trade out um, because someone's going to try and jump ahead of the Giants, who seem to be linked to a quarterback. Although I don't think even if McCarthy fell to them, that he would be the pick. So that's how I really think the top five plays out in that type of order. Four quarterbacks go, one receiver goes. I'd like for Marvin Harrison to slip to five because maybe that opens the door for a potential trade up with the Jets. Um, if that were to happen, I do believe still. I find it hard to believe that the Chargers won't pick Marvin Harrison Jr. Jim Harbaugh knows very well what Marvin Harrison Jr. can do on a football field, playing him at Ohio with Michigan against Ohio State for all those years. I think it would be something that he would identify. This is probably the best player in this draft. Um, has lineage, his father playing the NFL, is a Hall of Famer. I think it would be something that they would highly consider in this spot. I know he's likely wants to build in the trenches. That's his DNA. I do understand that, but when you have an opportunity to get a game-changing player, probably the best player in this draft at the fifth pick, um, I kind of find an interesting scenario there. But if he's not picking Marvin Harrison Jr., someone will jump into that spot if he's available. Is it the Jets? If it is the Jets, I'd be all down for it. What the likely cost would be is our first round pick this year, our first round pick next year, with a pick swap as well in there. And I think that gets it done. Maybe there's some middle round noise that has to happen there. But if that's what it takes to get the number one player in this draft, um, from a skill position standpoint, um, you know, pull the damn trigger, Joe Douglas, and let's score some points for once with this franchise. But that's kind of how I see it shaping out with the top five, four quarterbacks, one wide receiver, and then we get to the Giants pick. All the quarterbacks are gone. Well, the top quarterbacks are gone. Marvin Harrison Jr. is gone, and I think they shift focus to the next best weapon in this draft, in my opinion, and that's Malik Nabers. It's one situation here where I think Odunze could be considered, but if you really just kind of look at the tiers of these receivers, I think it goes Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Nabers pretty close to one another, and then the next phase is Odunze. It's not saying there's a huge drop off. I still think Odunze is a top 8 player in this draft, but I think Malik Nabers and Marvin Harrison Jr. are probably top 3 or 4, depending on how you shape it out. So continuing down this path, 7, I believe Tennessee will draft Joe Alt. If not Alt, some other offensive lineman. I'd be very shocked if there's a situation where it's not Alt. But again, going into last year, there was a lot of. I think most of us had Paris Campbell as top guy, but it's one of those situations where sometimes teams just have flavors for different types of players, different types of tackles. I think fits really what Tennessee wants, but it does not mean that there's not a situation where JC Latham, who's got a lot of momentum over the last week or so, that he might be a top 10 pick. It's something that would be very interesting to me. I personally do think Latham is a good player. I don't think he would fit into the Jets' top 10 in positional hierarchy or player hierarchy. So what I'm kind of getting at is if it's a player that I think that the Jets can kind of lure down into the top 10 of these picks, it pushes the players that I think would actually be their natural top 10 down the board a little bit. It's kind of similar to 4 quarterbacks going in. I don't think the Jets are picking a quarterback. So the more quarterbacks go in there, I mean, take 9 quarterbacks in the top 10 if you'd like. Um, That'll leave a Jets with a pretty nice surprise. But that's kind of how I see it. 7 being alt. Again, we're going kind of chalk here. I'm just kind of going through the scenarios here, um, running down the line here. Number 8, I think, is going to be a pretty interesting spot. Um, I think it's pretty apparent that Atlanta is going to want to go defense. And if they have multiple defensive players rated similarly, then I think it's a situation where a trade back to 10 is very beneficial for them. They get free capital. They'll drop down a few spots. Even if at 9 another defensive player is going, you're still getting a defensive player and another pick in exchange. And I think this is an interesting spot for a trade. Maybe the Jets do pick up the phone, especially if all the receivers start dropping off the board. There will be a run on these receivers. I don't think 3 receivers make it out of the top 10. Um, and especially if the board falls out this way, 9 becomes a potential trade target if Chicago doesn't pick a receiver themselves, because I think many people around the league probably eyeball the Jets similar to last year as wanting a skill player, and you'll have the opportunity to now go ahead of the Jets at 9 and get your skill player. So I think the Jets kind of in this scenario, like identifying that potential risk and jumping up 2 spots to get your receiver would be very, very interesting. If they play the hard ball, there are still many options falling down the list. Like you still have Odunze here, you still have Bowers here, and you still have multiple offensive tackles running through the scenario. So it could be a situation where Joe Douglas looks at his board and says, "Listen, we know what we want. We know that any of these players falling to us would be a hit. And if you have a player graded high, if they have Odunze for some reason as their number one wide receiver, and everyone else in the league has the way that I'm looking at it, it's a situation where I think you'd want to make a trade because the board fell in a way that is beneficial to you. But that's all I'm saying here. I think it's defensive player or a potential trade spot with for the Jets to move up a couple spots and get the player that they want. If it doesn't fall that way, and a defensive player is taken, I think 9 becomes unfortunately a situation where Odunze does get picked. Again, Chicago's picking a quarterback number one overall. What better way to help your quarterback than to get him a big target? I know that they have multiple weapons there. They have Keenan Allen, who's on a 1 year contract. They have they have more over there. So there's options for this team. Um, to potentially go outside of wide receiver, maybe even Bowers is an option here just to give you more skilled player weapons outside of just filling in your wide receiver. But Odunze is here at a what I believe to be beneficial situation for them because with Keenan Allen with 1 year left on his contract, you have Odunze right behind him, or as another outside wide receiver, and eventually Keenan Allen can walk if needed, and you have that guy to kind of replace him, assuming he develops the way that they would like. Then we get to 10th pick here. Again, if everything falls out this way, I think it really gets down to, and what I think the decision will end up being is Bowers or an offensive tackle. If it's about skill players, I think it will be Bowers here. I think there's a more likely than not scenario where the Jets are picking a receiver of some capacity, whether it's a wide receiver or a tight end here. So that's here. That's how I kind of see this top 10 falling out. Um, Bowers would be an outstanding hit. It would be another skill player, another wide receiver, somebody who's not just a tight end. He can split out as like your third wide receiver option. Um, because let's be honest here, after Garrett Wilson and Mike Williams, there's concern with the depth of your skill wide receiver or your pass catchers. Let's use that as the analogy here of how to explain these players. After those two, there is a drop off um, with your for the Jets depth chart. You need another guy. You need another receiver. I know that one can be acquired at 72, but with the value of the wide receiver position, how much that has grown over the past few years, it almost kind of becomes a huge hit here for the Jets to go with a tight end. Another option here for the Jets would be a trade out. um, there are going to be teams interested in Brock Bowers. There are going to be teams interested in another offense tackle. There may even be teams interested in a quarterback. I doubt a team would trade up into 10 for the fifth quarterback in the draft, but there are those scenarios. We never know how these things work out. Um, so the Jets will have options. The Jets will have good players fall to them. It is kind of the nature of the draft. Something is going to happen that we don't expect. And in this scenario, I went with the chalk, and there are going to be options. Bowers, offensive tackle, Odunze could fall to them at 10. And if any of those happen, I want the Jets to go with a pass catcher or trade back, get a second round pick, and make moves on day two to try and solidify the rest of this offense. And let's keep it in consideration here. We're all taking the approach that pick number 10 and pick number 72 are going to be an offensive players. I find it a little difficult to believe when you have a defensive minded head coach, you're going to completely ignore the defense side of the ball. Doesn't mean with those two picks they're going to pick a defense player, but I think they would like to try and drop back a little bit, regain a second round pick, so you do have the opportunity to grab a defensive player, especially if there's one available that's dropping. But that's kind of how I see it. If you haven't already, please like, subscribe to the channel. Leave me a comment. Where did I go wrong in this mock draft? There are definitely errors. I think probably the only thing that I got right is that the top three are going to be quarterbacks, and even that might be wrong. We might all be shocked when it comes to 8 o'clock, or I guess by 8:30 tonight. We'll know how the top three went. But again, leave me a comment, and most importantly, let's go Jets.